Before he became president, before Watergate, before the resignation that shocked the world, Richard Nixon was already fighting a battle, not with his opponents, but with himself. He wasn't born into wealth or political royalty. Unlike the polished elites of Washington, Nixon came from a modest Quaker family in California. He worked hard, studied harder, and built his career through relentless discipline. But there was something else, a deep insecurity. Those who knew him described a man brilliant in strategy, yet suspicious by nature, controlled in public, but restless in private. He distrusted the press. He distrusted political opponents, and eventually he began to distrust the system itself. To his supporters, he was a mastermind, the man who could outmaneuver anyone. To critics, he was cold, calculating, secretive. And that secrecy would become the foundation of something much larger. Because long before Watergate became a household word, Nixon had already developed a mindset. Power must be protected, enemies must be monitored, and loyalty must be absolute. What began as political survival was slowly evolving into something else. And in the quiet rooms of the White House, systems of secrecy were already taking shape. Richard Nixon was not supposed to make it. In Washington, power often belonged to men with pedigree, polished accents, elite schools, family names that opened doors. Nixon had none of that. What he had was discipline and ambition. He rose quickly, congressman, senator, vice president under Dwight Eisenhower. He built a reputation as a fierce anti-communist during the Cold War, sharp, relentless, unafraid of confrontation. But defeat changed him. In 1960, he narrowly lost the presidency to John F. Kennedy, a young, charismatic figure who embodied everything Nixon was not. Television had entered politics, and Nixon looked uncomfortable, tense, sweating under studio lights. He believed the media favored Kennedy. He believed the system tilted against him. And in 1962, after losing the California governor's race, he stood before reporters and delivered a bitter farewell. You won't have Nixon to kick around anymore. But they were wrong to count him out. In 1968, amid national chaos, Vietnam, protests, assassinations, Nixon returned. This time, he promised order, law and order. He won. And when he entered the White House, he carried more than ambition. He carried a deep memory of humiliation, a belief that enemies were everywhere, a conviction that survival required control. What had once been political instinct was slowly becoming something else. And in the quiet rooms of the White House, systems of secrecy were already taking shape. When Richard Nixon entered the White House in 1969, America was already exhausted. The Vietnam War had divided the country. Protests filled the streets. Trust in government was eroding. Nixon promised peace with honor. But behind closed doors, a different strategy was unfolding. Without public knowledge, his administration authorized secret bombing campaigns in Cambodia, a neutral country at the time. The objective was to disrupt North Vietnamese supply routes. The bombings were classified,
Even Congress was kept in the dark. Official records were altered, reports were rewritten. The truth was compartmentalized. It was a test of power. And it worked, at least temporarily. The war strategy expanded executive authority in ways few Americans fully understood. Inside the White House, Nixon relied heavily on a small inner circle. Among them was Henry Kissinger, his national security advisor, brilliant, strategic, and equally comfortable operating in secrecy. The logic was simple. If the mission is vital, secrecy is justified. If the threat is dangerous, extraordinary measures are necessary. But something was shifting. Secrecy was no longer just a tool of foreign policy. It was becoming a governing philosophy. And as protests intensified at home, especially after the Kent State shootings, Nixon's belief hardened. The press was hostile. Protesters were destabilizing the nation. Political opponents were not just rivals, but threats. In his mind, the presidency wasn't just an office, it was a battlefield, and he intended to win. By the early 1970s, Richard Nixon was no longer simply governing, he was defending. Defending against the press, defending against protesters, defending against political rivals, but most of all, defending against humiliation. Inside the White House, a quiet project was taking shape. It would later become known as the enemies list. Journalists, Democratic politicians, activists, even celebrities. Names were compiled, files were created, strategies were discussed. The idea was chilling in its simplicity. Use the machinery of government to pressure, audit, investigate, and discredit perceived opponents. The Internal Revenue Service was discussed as a weapon. Federal agencies were viewed not just as institutions, but as tools. Nixon believed leaks were everywhere. Conversations were recorded. Loyalty was tested constantly. To him, this wasn't corruption. It was protection. Protection of the presidency. Protection of power. And in that mindset, the line between national security and personal security began to blur. Because once a leader starts to believe that criticism equals sabotage, surveillance no longer feels extreme, it feels necessary. And from that belief, something operational was born. A small group of men tasked with stopping leaks, gathering intelligence, and doing what needed to be done. They called them the Plumbers.
June 17, 1972. In the early hours of the morning, 5 men were arrested inside the headquarters of the Democratic National Committee. The location, the Watergate complex in Washington, D.C. At first, it looked like a routine burglary, but it wasn't. The men carried wiretapping equipment, cameras, cash, false identification, and one detail stood out immediately. They were connected to President Richard Nixon's re-election campaign. The break-in was not random. It was an attempt to install listening devices, to gather political intelligence, to gain advantage. When news reached the White House, the reaction was swift and controlled. Publicly, the administration distanced itself. Privately, discussions began. How much did they know? How far would investigators go? And most importantly, how could it be contained? Because the break-in itself was dangerous, but the cover-up would be catastrophic. Money was arranged to keep the burglars silent. Pressure was applied. Stories were coordinated. Inside the Oval Office, conversations were being recorded, automatically, unknowingly, creating a time capsule of decisions made in real time. Nixon believed the situation could be managed.
After all, presidents had weathered scandals before, but this time was different. Two young reporters at the Washington Post began connecting the dots, following money trails, questioning official statements. The story refused to die. And what began as a political espionage attempt was slowly transforming into something far larger, a constitutional crisis. Because Watergate was not just about a break-in, it was about power, and whether the President of the United States was above the law. Inside the Oval Office, history was being recorded, literally. Without public knowledge, President Richard Nixon had installed a secret taping system. Conversations, strategy sessions, private discussions, every word captured. At first, the recordings were meant to preserve legacy and historical archive of presidential decision-making. But as the Watergate investigation intensified, those tapes became something else: evidence. In 1973, during Senate hearings, a former White House aide revealed the existence of the recording system. The room fell silent. If the tapes existed, they could confirm or destroy the president. Prosecutors demanded access. Nixon refused. He claimed executive privilege, the right to keep presidential communications confidential. The battle moved to the courts. And in a historic decision, the Supreme Court ruled unanimously against him. He had to release the tapes. When portions were finally made public, they revealed something undeniable. The president had participated in efforts to obstruct the investigation. There were discussions about using the CIA to block the FBI, conversations about managing the narrative, calculations about political survival. And then there was the infamous 18.5-minute gap, an audio segment erased. Accidentally, it was said. But the damage was done. The tapes didn't just expose strategy, they exposed intent. And for the first time, impeachment was no longer theoretical. It was imminent. The walls were closing in, and Nixon knew it. By the summer of 1974, the pressure was unbearable. Members of Congress from both parties had seen enough. The House Judiciary Committee approved articles of impeachment against President Richard Nixon: obstruction of justice, abuse of power, contempt of Congress. The support that once protected him was evaporating. Republican allies visited the White House with a quiet but devastating message: you no longer have the votes. Inside the Oval Office, the man who had spent his life fighting to rise above humiliation now faced the ultimate political defeat. On August 8, 1974, Nixon addressed the nation. His voice was steady, controlled, almost clinical. He announced that he would resign the presidency, effective the next day. It was the first time in American history that a sitting president stepped down. The next morning, he boarded Marine One. He paused at the top of the stairs, raised both arms in his signature V-shaped gesture, and left the White House behind. But resignation did not end the story. It only changed the question. Was Watergate the scandal that destroyed a presidency, or was it the inevitable result of a system of secrecy, surveillance, and unchecked executive power that had been building for years? Because if Watergate was only the moment of exposure, what does that say about everything that came before? Richard Nixon had resigned, but he had not been convicted. 1 month later, the new president, Gerald Ford, made a change that shocked the nation. He granted Nixon a full and unconditional pardon for any crimes he may have committed while in office. No trial, no conviction, no public reckoning. Ford argued the country needed healing. He believed a prolonged prosecution would keep America trapped in political trauma. But many Americans saw it differently. To them, it looked like protection, a private deal, a political escape. Ford's approval ratings collapsed almost overnight. Trust in government, already fragile after Vietnam and Watergate, sank even further. For the first time, millions of Americans openly questioned, if the president breaks the law, who holds him accountable? Nixon retreated from public life. He later rebuilt part of his image through interviews and foreign policy work. Over time, historians would acknowledge his diplomatic achievements, especially his opening to China and détente with the Soviet Union. But Watergate never disappeared. It became shorthand for corruption, a warning, a suffix added to every future scandal. And yet, one deeper question remained. Was Nixon uniquely flawed, or did Watergate reveal vulnerabilities within the presidency itself?
When people hear the word Watergate, they think of a scandal, a break-in, secret tapes, a resignation. But Watergate may have been something else, a mirror. Because what it revealed wasn't just the flaws of Richard Nixon. It exposed how much power the presidency had accumulated. Secret bombings conducted without full congressional awareness. Government agencies discussed as political tools. Surveillance justified in the name of security. Executive privilege pushed to its limits. Nixon didn't invent executive power, but he tested how far it could go. And after his resignation, reforms followed. Campaign finance laws, intelligence oversight committees, greater scrutiny of presidential authority. Yet over the decades, debates about executive power have returned again and again. National security versus transparency, secrecy versus accountability, power versus restraint. So the real question isn't just, was Nixon corrupt? It's deeper than that. Was Watergate an isolated scandal, or was it a warning about what can happen when power operates in the shadows? History rarely repeats itself in the same way, but it echoes, and Watergate still echoes today. Richard Nixon never admitted full guilt. He never stood trial. He never returned to the Oval Office, but he also never completely disappeared. In the years that followed, he rebuilt parts of his image. He advised presidents. He wrote books. He traveled the world. History softened in some areas, but Watergate never did. It became more than a scandal. It became a symbol of what can happen when power operates without restraint, a symbol of secrecy justified in the name of survival, and perhaps most importantly, a symbol of how fragile public trust can be. The presidency survived, the Constitution survived, but something changed in 1974. Americans no longer looked at their leaders the same way. And maybe that was the real turning point, because Watergate wasn't just about Richard Nixon. It was about the limits of power. And the moment the system proved that even the most powerful man in the world could fall.